I don't actually know what I agreed to lecture on, but what I'm actually going to lecture on is who wrote your Magna Carta, who wrote the Salisbury Magna Carta. Now, in theory, we know who wrote Magna Carta. It was King John. And he did so in June 1215, using that Parker pen, or the medieval equivalent of it, that you can see him using there. Which is why, when the Royal Mint came to produce their anniversary coin this year, for the 800th anniversary, they showed King John with a pen in one hand and Magna Carta in the other, looking really rather disgustingly cheerful, I should say. Now, the Americans, who are given to pedantry on such topics, got this right a long time ago. These are the great bronze doors of the Supreme Court in Washington, and there you will see that back then in 1934, the Americans already knew that John didn't sign Magna Carta. He sealed it. And you can see John using there one of those seal things that they use when you go through immigration in America. When you go into JFK and they stamp your passport, he is stamping his authority on Magna Carta. Now, in what follows, I'm going to attempt something that I think probably has never been attempted before, at least by no sane man. I'm going to give you a lecture on paleography, the science of writing in the Middle Ages, and I'm going to do so at a level that I do not regard as disgracefully debased. But I hope that you will see that there is a purpose to this. And although the pictures will come thick and fast, and many of them may look identical, as, let us admit, they do in a lot of David Attenborough's programs on the television, Oh Lord, some more bloomin' giraffes. In this case, Oh Lord, some more bloomin' charters. I hope at the end you'll see that there is actually a story worth telling here. John did not sign Magna Carta, he sealed it, and I was in the archive earlier on. As Ed says, I work there quite regularly, and I've been able to extract some seals from the archive. I just cut them off while they wasn't booked. It's the physicality of it that I want you to bear in mind in what follows. And to give you some idea of what we're talking about a charter. Now, this is an average science charter that I acquired from eBay about 10 years ago, and I use it as illustration. I acquired this from eBay about 10 years ago, and I use it as illustration. I'm just standing there in order that I can pass these things around. It's going to be tricky for me to throw it, but I could turn it into an aeroplane, perhaps. This is written on parchment, which is the material that was used for the writing of medieval charters. And parchment is just sheepskin. I did a television program a little while ago with a little old lady down in Kent who was showing off a Kent Magna Carta. And she announced to the television reporters there that Magna Carta, she said, you know, is written on moleskin. So I didn't quite know what to explain there, because you need a very, very scary-sized mole and a really, really powerful mangle to get out something the size of Magna Carta. And if you think about it, Magna Carta, which is a peace treaty between king and barons, agreed in June 1215, between King John and the barons who'd rebelled against him, almost exactly 800 years ago today. On Sunday, coming up 800 years ago, the barons seized London. Magna Carta is just a big charter written on sheepskin. And the reason it contains its 62 or so clauses is because that's as many as you can fit on the side of a medieval sheep. Now, I am not going to be talking very much today about the intellectual background to Magna Carta. This is a subject which has been well covered, which I've covered myself talking here before, and which I think I'm going to be talking about here again in September. But you must think of this place as a monument in stone to various of the principles embodied in Magna Carta. Just behind me on the wall here is one of those great consecration crosses from the consecration of this building in the 1250s, following its foundation in the 1220s, 5 or so years after Magna Carta. The purpose of this building was to bring the earthly Jerusalem, the church, out of bondage to King Saul, King David, to the evil Plantagenet kings, to bring it down the hill from Old Sarum to its location here on the banks of the river. And in this building, and in the history of this building, from the word go, was embedded an idea that church and state were two separate operations, and that the church's role was to remind the state of where kings went wrong, where they had behaved like Old Testament tyrants, and the state's role principally was to protect the church. Now, all of that is embodied very much in the life of the bishop who founded this cathedral, Bishop Richard Poore, who had been dean here before he went to be Bishop of Chichester at the time of Magna Carta, then returned to Salisbury as bishop and ended his life as Bishop of Durham, a great reformer who transformed the lives of 3 dioceses within the English Church. And within the circle of Richard Poore moved a number of men, including this man. This is not actually him. This is a rather feeble portrait, I shouldn't say that, done in the 1940s in memory of the man who in the 1940s, and I think again today, is widely regarded as the architect of this building, a man named Elias of Durham. And within that cathedral close, this land of liberty, set in the heart of an episcopal city, freed from the bondage of the crown, you would have found, at the time of Magna Carta and after, an entire group of men, Elias of Durham, William of Wood, Richard Poore, and Thomas of Chobham, the great author of treatises on sermons, on the Bible, on the explanation of the matter of faith to the faithful. You would have found a great circle of men who'd grown up with a theological training in which they were taught to use the Old Testament as a typology of good and bad kings. And a great deal of what they thought about, many of them were trained in the schools of Paris in this sort of theology, was channeled through the library of this great cathedral. Now, earlier this summer, I came here looking really in the library to see whether there were manuscripts from the time of Magna Carta. And although you have a fantastic collection of 12th century manuscripts from the time of Old Sarum, and although you have a very fine collection of later manuscripts, the period of the cathedral's refoundation in the 1220s is rather poorly represented. But again, you must think of the cathedral library here as the intellectual powerhouse of those ideas that fueled the reform of this diocese and the reform of the realm through Magna Carta. At Runnymede, 800 years ago, there gathered not just the barons, but the bishops, headed by Archbishop Stephen Langton. There you see Stephen Langton on one side of his seal, and there on the back of his seal, that seal that's going around, you'll see on one side shows a king doing justice. On the back side of the seal, a king riding into battle, doing what kings also do, make war. On the back of Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury's seal, is an image of the murder of Thomas Becket. And over there you have the chapel of St. Thomas, a commemoration within this cathedral of a saint who transformed the image of the Plantagenet dynasty in the eyes of the church and the eyes of the world. After Becket's murder, commemorated on the back of the seal of the archbishop who was present at the negotiations at Runnymede, on the back of Langton's seal, those events, the murder of Thomas Becket in the cathedral in 1170, transformed the image of the Plantagenet kings so that henceforth they could only be seen in the eyes of the church as sons of the devil. All of that division of church from state, is crucial to the background to Magna Carta. It's written into the very opening clause of the Charter itself, which is granted not to you or me or the free men and women of England, but to God. It's granted to God so that the king cannot simply rescind this grant. But even so, it places the liberties of the church above the liberties of you, me, the barons, the earls, the knights, above those liberties that today we believe are essential to the survival of Magna Carta. And even within the negotiation of Magna Carta famously, towards the end, imposes a council of 25 barons upon the king. If the king goes against the terms of the charter, these barons are empowered to rise up against him. Why 25 barons? Because from the reading of men like Langton or Richard Poore or Elias of Durham, in 1215, there was a realization that St. Augustine, as long ago as the 4th century, had told us that 25 is the perfect number of the law. 25 is the number of the law because there are 5 books of law in the Old Testament of the Bible, the Pentateuch. Square that number and you arrive at the number 25. And that's why we have, in Magna Carta 1215, a committee of 25 barons. Elias of Dereham, the supposed designer of this building, played a prominent role, which I may come back to describe in September when I address the Friends of the Cathedral. Elias played a prominent role in the publication of Magna Carta in the summer of 1215. Now that's, as it were, the intellectual background, and that is not really what I'm going to be talking about this evening. I want to talk much more about the physicality of the Charter, about the Charter as a physical artifact handled by King John at Runnymede and preserved thereafter. Here's John signing Magna Carta, and here are the 4 Magna Cartas in no particular order of precedence, but beginning with the Lincoln Magna Carta, which you can see there, and the Salisbury Magna Carta. I expect a cheer at that point. And there are representatives here from the British Library, so there may be a feeble squeak from the back of this room. The unburnt British Library Charter, they're called the Cotton Charters because they belong to a great manuscript collector of the 17th century called Sir Robert Cotton. The unburnt British Library Magna Carta, which has no seal, and the burnt Cotton Charter, this went up in flames in the 1730s, which has a seal reduced to something looking a bit like a chewed-up toffee. We know what that burnt charter looked like because shortly after its burning, an engraver called Pine made a very good engraving of it, an image of it. It was still pretty legible throughout the 18th century, through to the 1820s when it was preserved using a mixture of honey and wine. If any of you have ancient documents at home, I would advise you against the use of honey and wine as a preservative. Now, it's the physicality of those documents, and in due course of the reissues of Magna Carta, as Magna Carta came to be rewritten through the 13th century, that I want to address today. Through this rather arcane science of paleography, the study of ancient writing. Now, let's look in very, very broad outline at your Magna Carta, at the Salisbury Magna Carta. Here it is, and I saw it in the post office round the corner here. You can buy Magna Carta bath towels and Magna Carta tea towels and Magna Carta children's toys and everything else, fridge magnets, everything. There it is. It's a physical artifact. There are a number of things to say about it. It's lost its seal, but you can see that it's got at least 2 holes, or the remains of 2 holes at the bottom, from which cords hung, and someone at some point has ripped out the cords and the seal, leaving that scar at the bottom of the document that looks like a big M. And if you look at the text of the Charter, if you look at it close up, you will see that it is written in a very distinctive hand. Now, this is not a standard hand of the King's Writing Office, of the King's Chancery. It's far too posed, it's far too artificial, it's the sort of hand that we would find in a book rather than on a charter. Or at least it's somewhere halfway between a book hand and a charter hand. And I was looking at it earlier on today in your archive. I wasn't actually looking at the original, I was looking at a very good facsimile, and noticing a number of things that it's worth pointing out to you. One is that the writing gets progressively smaller as the scribe gets towards the end of the document. That's because he's realized that he's running out of space. He's got an awful lot of text, and he hasn't properly calculated the amount of space that he's got left. So he has to reduce the size of his writing, which is already very small. And the other thing is that the final line of the document, you can see down at the bottom, it ends with the 17th year of King John's reign, Septimo Decimo, does not fill the final line. In a truly professional charter, you would expect that word to be stretched out so that nobody could introduce a clause at the end saying, "And I, King John, can sleep with all your daughters," or whatever else it is. "I, the Dean of Salisbury, can have your house," whatever else it is that they might care to introduce. So the Salisbury Magna Carta has always been seen as the Cinderella amongst those Magna Cartas. It's always been seen as somewhat out on a limb. A series of rather bizarre suggestions have been made that it's much later than the others. I don't think that's right. That maybe it was copied out in person by Elias of Dereham or by Richard Poor. I think that that is also most improbable. But I do hope by the end of this evening to explain to you something of how it came to be written and why that matters. Now, I got interested in all of this really by a circuitous route. I'm really a historian. And in 2007, because I work on that period, I was called in by Sotheby's to write the catalogue when Ross Perot came to sell a Magna Carta, a very late Magna Carta of 1297, that he had acquired from the Brudenell family of Dean Park in Northamptonshire in the 1980s. It's one of 24 Magna Cartas that survived from the 13th century because after the 1215 Magna Cartas, the document was reissued in a revised form, and all told, 24 of these documents survive. Well, that thing involved writing at very, very great haste a catalogue, and in the end, that document was sold for $21.3 million in New York, and of that I saw not a penny. What I did realize, though, when I came to write that catalogue, was that essentially, since the 18th century, and I'm terribly sorry, Edward, but Edward gave us summer pudding for dinner this evening, and I have lots of seeds floating around in my mouth, so if I begin spitting at you, please don't take it personally. What it made me realize was that really, since the 18th century, very little work had been done on the physical nature of Magna Carta. The assumption had grown that this document is so well known that there's nothing new to say about it. All of the really important work must have been done back then by people like William Blackstone, who in the 1750s published a commentary on Magna Carta in which he listed all of the surviving originals of Magna Carta known to him. Now, what I realized very quickly was that that was myth. That because this document has been in plain view for so long a period of time, people have grown complacent and assumed that the basic spade work on this document had been done when it hadn't. I realized that the only listing of Magna Cartas and associated documents that was used even into the 1990s by historians depended ultimately from Blackstone, coming via this great series of Statutes of the Realm that was published at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1812. It's on the basis of that list that we, in the 1990s, assumed that there were roughly 20 Magna Cartas surviving in England. It's on the basis of that list that valuations and commentaries on the Charter had been written. And yet, as I hope you realize, in the world of archives and libraries, a great deal has moved on, certainly in the outside world, if not in Salisbury, since 1812. As part of the physicality of the document, I unearthed the extraordinary story of Winston Churchill's attempt to give the Lincoln Magna Carta to the American people in 1941. The Lincoln Magna Carta had been sent across the Atlantic to be displayed, and it got stranded there at the outbreak of war in 1939. In 1941, Churchill put a proposal to the Cabinet to gift the Magna Carta from Lincoln to the American people as a means of bringing the Americans in on the side of Britain in the Second World War. Now, that was a very good idea, but it fell on one basic problem, which was that Churchill and the Cabinet didn't own the Lincoln Magna Carta. The Dean and Chapter of Lincoln, this rather terrifying bunch of men, owned the Lincoln Magna Carta, and when they found out what was going on, were not very well pleased about it. So, Magna Carta was actually held in Fort Knox during World War II and then restored to Lincoln. You see its restoration here, Dr. Quatermass, we can rebuild it, in the late 1940s. I was also at the same time able to unearth the rather ghastly story of what happened thereafter, because being careful people, the Dean and Chapter then sent the Lincoln Magna Carta. You will be terribly sorry here in Salisbury to hear this. They sent the Lincoln Magna Carta, I must say the finest of all the Magna Cartas that survived through to 1950. They sent it to the Public Record Office in London to be repaired. And there, according to an utterly mendacious letter from Sir Hilary Jenkinson, the then director of the Public Record Office, regrettable damage occurred to the document due to internal deterioration from some organic cause. For example, a fungoid affection I hope none of you are suffering from that, which might have developed in the long period during which it was, as I understand, immured between sheets of glass. Look at the language there. That's a liar. That's someone saying, I'm terribly sorry, but the man who dampened down this document using a sponge and some water leant on it too hard and rubbed off quite a lot of the writing. And that's what you see before you. You see the rather faded fragment of the Lincoln Magna Carta in consequence of that restoration in 1950. You have been far wiser. You have never sent your Magna Carta to the Public Record Office. Or at least if you have, you've kept a very close eye on what they did to it. Now, realizing all of that, realizing that there were a lot more stories to tell, about 3 years ago, we put together a major project involving the British Library, my university, All Souls Oxford, and a half a dozen other institutions, including me and a series of colleagues, called the Magna Carta Project. Go online to something, you just type in Magna Carta Research. And we've got various strands to this project. He's one of them. He opened a great big exhibition that we helped organize, and Julian Harrison, who helped organize that exhibition, is sitting at the back of this room today. Prince Charles opened that exhibition about a month ago, announcing that in Runnymede, he said, in that damp meadow was lit a flame that burns still, the flame of freedom. Now, I don't know who wrote that speech. It was a very good speech, and we'll come back to the nature of kings and writing and whether kings actually write their own speeches in due course. But as part of that exhibition, you can see all sorts of things at the moment in London in this great British Library exhibition. Prince Charles is looking at one of them. This is the effigy of King John in Worcester Cathedral. That's Claire Bray, one of the other organisers, next to him. And he's looking at King John's teeth, which are displayed there. They were in John's tomb in Worcester, and not only King John's teeth, but his thumb bone. So you can imagine him pushing down with his thumb bone and grinding his teeth at the time of the issue of Magna Carta. We are in the physical world of documents and the signing and sealing of them. Part of what we've got on that site is a commentary on Magna Carta, a clause-by-clause commentary by Henry Summerson, the first to be published since 1915, that explains the meaning of the document. Part of it is an exceptionally dull, day-by-day account of what King John was up to. I know it's exceptionally dull because I write it week by week, and it is the bane of my life. Even now I'm thinking, oh Lord, on Sunday I have to go back to May 1215 and find out what King John had for breakfast. But that takes you through, in an extraordinary detail, the actual events of 1215. And that goes in hand with a whole series of special features on various events of the time. There's also part of that site given over to schools by Louise Wilkinson, materials for the teaching of Magna Carta in schools. And then this bit, which is the bit I want to focus on now, the charters of King John. Those 4 Magna Cartas are 4 amongst a far larger number of documents that the king issued. And over the last 3 years, I've gone around Britain and elsewhere, hoovering up as many examples of the work of King John's writing office as I can find. That's a typical example of a charter of King John with the Great Seal hanging down at the bottom of it. Now, part of the highlight of our time with these documents came about a month ago when we brought together the Salisbury, Lincoln and the 2 British Library Magna Cartas in London for a period of 3 days, the first time that they'd been reunited in 800 years. Of course, that's not entirely true because it's not clear that they were ever united in the first place, but they were brought together after 800 years. Now that was, if I may say so, a magnificent publicity stunt and really served no scholarly purpose whatsoever. But it did, because like lots of those things which you think are going to be a publicity stunt, it actually brought to light some very significant information. It enabled us to prove for certain sure that the burnt Cotton Charter, the burnt British Library Magna Carta, did not come, as has been supposed, from Dover Castle in the 17th century, but from Canterbury Cathedral. The individual words, the individual copying of that manuscript by an individual scribe is identical to a copy of Magna Carta in one of the cartularies, one of the books of charters of Canterbury Cathedral, and shows that that document came from Canterbury. Bringing those documents together enabled us to look in greater detail at the unburnt Cotton Charter. And there we still don't know exactly where that came from. The chances are that we've got a Lincoln one from a cathedral, and a Salisbury one from a cathedral, and a Canterbury one from a cathedral, that this too came from a cathedral archive. And one day, this is what's written on the back of it, somebody will match up that writing, Magna Carta Angliae, the Great Charter of England, they will match that up against the writing on the back of documents from a cathedral archive somewhere in England, and we will know where this Cotton Charter came from. We were also, thanks to the wonders of technology in the British Library, able to look properly at the spectrographic analysis of the front of the document. Even if you look at the Salisbury Magna Carta today, you'll see it generally under subdued lighting. If you take in a collection of biro pens to the Salisbury Magna Carta, you are not encouraged to write on the surface of the document. Indeed, policemen will be called if you attempt to do so. But what was noticed when this document was then looked at properly under analysis is that there is indeed writing all the way down the margin. The writing itself is rather dull. It says things like de ecclesia, about the church, about the scutage, about the barons, about tax. The actual individual terms are really just dividing the charter into chapters, but they show that someone of very great significance, one assumes, very great authority, at some point in the late 14th or early 15th century, was able to get access to an original Magna Carta and write on it. And they fit very neatly into what we had recently discovered was a tendency in the late 14th century for copies of the 1215 Magna Carta to be made. This, for example, turned up in Gloucester Cathedral just after Christmas. It's just a copy from the 1390s of the 1215 Magna Carta. But notice how it's described. In red, it says, Carta Johannis Regis, the Charter of King John, of the liberties of England, and about the 25 barons. The interest then, in the 1390s, was in the 25 barons. Now that's explicable, because at that time, the barons of Richard II, King of England, were trying to do to him what the barons of King John had done in 1215. In other words, what that writing on the front of Magna Carta, the unburnt Cotton Charter, shows is that Magna Carta was still being used for political purposes as late as the 1390s. A lot of what's turned up is actually simply new and undiscovered. About a year ago in Lambeth Palace, this is Lambeth Palace as it was, it's fallen on rather hard times, but this is a manuscript in Lambeth Palace that's well known. M.R. James, the great manuscript scholar, used this manuscript, catalogued it, but clearly his fingers stuck when he turned the page on which this particular document is displayed, because he says nothing about it in his catalogue. It's a very, very important document. I won't go into the details, and those of you at the back will barely be able to make it out. But basically, it's the publication schedule for Magna Carta in the summer of 1215. We've always known that such a document must have existed, that the charter was indeed published in the county courts and oaths were sworn to it, but this explains the circumstances in which that publication took place. It's a document of fundamental significance, and it is previously entirely unknown. In December this year, I gave a talk in Belfast, and late at night, Belfast is not a place really where you want to go out wandering. So I returned to my hotel and I trawled the internet. And being a nerd, I trawled the site of the Kent Record Office in Maidstone, where I knew I was going in a few days' time, looking for material on King John or Magna Carta. And I typed in, I'm a clever person, I'm an expert, and therefore I typed in an expert search term into the box that said search. I typed in the search term Magna Carta. And up came a reference not to Magna Carta, but to something called the Forest Charter, which is a younger sibling of Magna Carta that swims with it. So I emailed at 4 a.m. from Belfast the archivist in Maidstone that I know and said, could you go and look in the box and see if that is really a Forest Charter, because it's not known if it is. And he went and looked in the box, and 2 days later he emailed back and said, I looked in the box, it's quite nice, that Forest Charter. There's also what I think is Magna Carta next to it. Now, this is from the Borough Archive of Sandwich in Kent. It's not a very beautiful document, as you will see, and we won't go into detail on what precisely may have happened to that horrible brown bit on the right-hand side of the document. But it's not a very beautiful document. It is very important. It's the only Magna Carta to have been discovered in the last 100 years from scratch. Nobody knew that this existed. And that was a rather wonderful discovery that went around the world. In order to bring this up to date, this week I was working in Lincoln's Inn, and I had some notes from about 20 years ago of this manuscript. This is a series of 17th century copies, and my note said there's quite a nice charter of Isabella, Countess of Gloucester, that she was the divorced wife of King John, who was then used as a sort of seed corn for making money. The king basically sold her off to one of his barons called Geoffrey de Mandeville for a huge amount of money, which Geoffrey was unable to pay. Geoffrey joined the rebels in 1215. Geoffrey then died in a tournament in London, in rebel-held London, after Runnymede. But what those documents are, and again you don't need to see the detail here, what they are is an extraordinary record, and I only found these on Wednesday this week. They're an extraordinary record of the presence of at least 10 of the 25 barons in London as late as May 1216. What they show is that the baronial committee of 25, we don't know it was certainly operating, but it was still active in rebel-held London as late as the summer of 1216, a year after Magna Carta. And that does indeed alter the way that we look at the baronial side of the rebellion against King John. Now, the day before we brought together our 4 Magna Cartas, the 4 original Magna Cartas, we were able, this is Tessa Webber, who is a reader in paleography at Trinity College, Cambridge. This is Tessa Webber and me looking rather worried because we were able to bring together 230 charters of King John, albeit as photographs. And that's where they come from. They come from all over the world, from Oslo, from America, from Washington, from New York, from all over France, from Belgium, and from about 90 libraries and archives in England. These are the charters that the king sent out that have been preserved ever since. And you've got 2 of them, apart from your Magna Carta. You've got this one. This is a charter of King John issued in 1200, and this one issued 2 years later. And they're quite a nice pair. That's a big, important grant of liberties, a general confirmation. That's a much more writ-like document, a much more routine sort of document in which the king sends instructions for things to be done. Now, there are problems with the distribution of those documents because an enormous number of them come from the very early years of King John's reign. Whenever a new king was appointed, he had to reissue the charters of his predecessor, and therefore we have this big spike at the beginning. And by the time we get through to the end of the reign, the middle of John's reign was a bad time. The church was on strike. There was this period of interdict where the church withdrew its services from the king and the nation, and from that period we have virtually no charters. I think what that shows us is that the administrative operations of the court also went into severe decline. It wasn't just that we don't have the records, it's that the records were never issued. Otherwise, there would not be that great dip. And then we have quite a few documents from the end of the reign, particularly from 1215, but bear in mind that a lot of those are actually Magna Cartas or relics of Runnymede. People who went to Runnymede realized that they were taking part in very important events, and they carried away with them important memorials of what they'd seen. And that's that plotted as a graph. It looks good, but it shows you that there's a problem in identifying the handwriting of those instruments from the later periods of the reign. And it's that nerdish pursuit that I now want to come on to, the science of paleography. That's the reign. Most of the charters come from the second part of the reign, not from the first. Paleography is the art of actually looking at the writing of a document and seeing what it tells us, its physical message. Here, for example, we've got a standard charter issued by King John for a beneficiary in Ireland. And it's one of those wonderful Irish charters. It says, I grant so-and-so the great fever swamp that stretches from here to everywhere. And I grant him all the forests of the moon and everything else. All of these prospective grants in Ireland of what turned out to be a horrible bog. But the charter is remarkable also for the writing at the bottom. If you look down at the bottom of that document, there is a sort of postscript. And what it says is this charter was renewed 7 years later. And it gives the date. Now that, again, can only have been written by a major official within the Royal Chancery, and I suspect that that is the handwriting of the then de facto Chancellor, Hugh of Wells, future Bishop of Lincoln. In other words, we can actually begin to get not the signatures of these people, they didn't sign things, they used seals, but we can get the characteristic writing of these individuals. This is a charter that survives in Stafford. It gives away some of the forest in Staffordshire. On the fold at the bottom of the document, you'll see some upside-down writing, and if I turn it up, it says basically 300 marks and 2 palfreys. Palfreys are the workhorses of the 13th century. They're the Ford Cortina horse, which clerks use to get around on. And they're often used as a form of payment. And this is the fine that was made by the men of Staffordshire to have their charter. So we get an insight into the king's financial exactions from the proper study of this document. Now, this raises a wiser question. Could King John actually read his own documents? Did Prince Charles actually write that rather wonderful speech that was given in the British Library? We've always thought of King John as a writing and reading sort of man. He was trained initially as a clerk, and he did own books. We know that he owned, for example, a copy of Pliny's Natural History. Whether that copy is the great Pliny that survives in the Bibliothèque Municipale at Le Mans is not clear, but there is a strong case for suggesting that this book, for example, belonged to either John or his father, King Henry II. It's covered in purple and gold. It's a very royal-looking book. It's said that John actually signed one of his books, a copy of Seneca's Letters, that survives in the University Library in Leiden, in modern-day Belgium. And you can see, perhaps if you've got very good eyesight, there is indeed pencil marking down at the bottom of that folio, but it isn't really a signature by the king. It just says, Johannes Dei Gratia Rex, John by the grace of God, King. It's some sort of pen exercise. Or maybe it's someone saying, one of the horrible characters in Seneca reminds me of King John. John, like all kings, relied upon clerks to do his writing for him, upon scribes. Upon quite how many scribes, we're not certain. But we do know that the majority of the king's letters, as early as the 1160s, were issued from an official writing office. In some cases, people would turn up at court and say, "O king, would you seal this important writing that I've brought? We've had it written out very neatly." That was the old-fashioned way of doing things. But by the 12th century, the kings of England were producing that big blue mark, looks a bit like the map of the election, actually, but including the purple bit. That big blue mark is the production of the king's chancery. The majority of letters and charters issued by Henry II were officially issued by his own scribes, written out by someone who attached to him. And all told, those 2 or 3 big blocks, the green block is miscellaneous scribes attached to the court. The purple and blue blobs are 2 particular scribes. We give them the very inventive names scribe number 35 and scribe number 40. They're 2 scribes who wrote the majority of the king's letters. In other words, the vast majority of Henry II's 500 or so surviving letters were written by only 2 men. Now, can we do this for King John? With our 225 cards in our pack of playing cards, in our pack of charters, can we shuffle that pack into a series of happy families written by the same scribe? Now, I'm going to go quite fast here because I realize that you are not necessarily going to be able to tell the difference between one scribe and another, and I don't expect you to, but you may see some of the outline here. Here's a charter for the men of Nottingham, March 1200. Here's a charter for the men of Appleby, a long way further north, March 1200. Put them together, they're written by the same scribe. There are lots of other scribes at work who look a bit like that. Don't get your hopes up here, we're in for a rocky ride. There are lots of other scribes who look a bit like that, but on occasion we find something that's really very distinctive. Here's that charter for the men of Stafford. Here's a charter I saw a month ago in Wilton Town Hall. It's still there in the town hall. It's in a glass cabinet, and you can just walk in off the street and take it if you're in that sort of mood. But it's there. It's a very nice charter of King John, and it's written in the same hand as the charter from Staffordshire. Tessa and I, being technicians here, have given this scribe not a number, that would be very dull. We've called him the roundy scribe. It's a technical term. Well, the roundy scribe wrote lots and lots of King John's charters. He wrote that one, now in Aberystwyth. He wrote that one, now in Leeds. He wrote that one in Belvoir Castle, home of UKIP. He wrote that one, now in Lincoln. Boo! He wrote that one, now in Shrewsbury, and so on, and Leeds, and so we go on, and Norwich even. And they're all written in the same hand. Now that enables us, even in a case like that where we've got a tiny fragment of a charter, the rest of that document was eaten by rats or mice, or perhaps by Lord Berkeley. It's in Lord Berkeley's archive. But we can actually say that that is written by the roundy scribe, and that enables us to date it, and it also enables us to identify it. So that shuffling of the pack already takes us places. And it does indeed suggest that the majority of the king's charters at any one particular time were written by one particular scribe. There was a succession of these people, but there was, as it were, one official master of writing at work at any particular time. And that master of writing did decorate his stuff, so we begin to get the origins of decorated letters at the opening of the king's charters. The Johannes there is decorated. So is that, in a rather ugly way, by a much later and uglier scribe from Ipswich. What would you expect from Ipswich? But you can see, I'm sorry, I come from Norwich. You've got, up the top, he's decorated that bit, and down the bottom, he's drawn sort of horrible, crude squiggles in an Ipswichian way. In due course, that will lead on to the situation where scribes actually put these fantastic artistic representations of kingship at the head of their documents. This comes from southern France, but it's just the opening of a royal letter, and look at the magnificence with which King John's grandson is displayed there. This is from Shrewsbury. This is Richard II's charter for the men of Shrewsbury, and it comes as close, I think, as we'll ever come to seeing what a king actually did when he granted a charter. He sort of holds it in his hand and passes it on. It's passing his hand over the charter. Well, John starts us on the road towards that level of decoration. And now we come, as it were, to the interesting bit. Now, we have 4 Magna Cartas from 1215. Who wrote those Magna Cartas? How can we find that out? We go to the other charters that were issued in 1215, and here's a list of them. Now, they divide into 2 basic types. We've got the big charters, the charters, and we've got the writs, the administrative instructions. And some of those writs are really very interesting. This one at Hereford is the instructions for establishing peace after Magna Carta at Runnymede. It's actually issued at Runnymede on the 20th of June, 5 days after Magna Carta. This one in Worcester Cathedral is also very interesting. It's King John's will, the first surviving will of an English king, first surviving original will. And put them together, it is quite possible, and I'm going to be very careful now in my use of English, it is quite possible that they are written by the same scribe. The problem is that they use a generic style of handwriting that is very difficult to tell apart. We know it's very difficult to tell apart because we have, from slightly later, a whole series of advertisements by clerks, by scriveners, by writing masters, who announce, using these advertisements, I can write like this, and I can write like that, and I can write like that letter on the right-hand side or that letter on the left-hand side. And if necessary, I can write music. So scribes themselves alter their hand for particular circumstances. So we have to be very cautious here. Now, throwing all caution to the wind immediately, I will not be cautious, and I will say that it is very likely that the majority of charters from that year 1215 were written by one particular scribe. He wrote all those in red and possibly the one in green. And again, for those who suffer from epilepsy, please turn away now because you may suffer very badly. But you'll see there is a progression of probability here. These are probably written by the same person. Matlock, Truro, think of these wonderful places I've been to, haven't been there. Oslo, can't afford to go there. Ipswich, Hagley Hall, well, that was sold to the Americans, which is why you can only see a facsimile of it. And the London Metropolitan Archives, this is a charter issued exactly 800 years ago, granting the Londoners the right to elect their mayor. All of those, I would suggest, are written by the same scribe. Now, that's important, because that scribe did not write any of the Magna Cartas. Who did? Here's the Lincoln Magna Carta after its tragic fate in 1950. Here's the beginning, and here's the end. Here's a charter issued by King John a month after Runnymede to the Bishop of Lincoln in July 1215. And down at the bottom, there's the beginning. Up at the top, there's the beginning of the Lincoln Magna Carta. Down there, there's the bottom of that charter issued a month after Magna Carta to the Bishop of Lincoln. Up at the top, there's Magna Carta in Lincoln. And look particularly at the word septimo decimo. They are, I believe, written by the same scribe. Here's a charter on the left-hand side that was written in January 1215, 6 months before Magna Carta, next to the charter of July, written a month after the Lincoln Magna Carta. Those are also written in the same hand. And guess what? They're all to the Bishop of Lincoln. Here's a charter of the Bishop of Lincoln, issued in August 1217. And here's one in September 1217. And here's one in October 1217. Put them all together, they are also written by the same scribe. Now, what I am saying there is that the Lincoln Charter, it's not a forgery. The Lincoln Charter was written by a local Lincoln scribe attached to the Bishop of Lincoln, Hugh of Wells. In other words, not only did Lincoln preserve its charter, but it wrote it. And that's very important because it suggests that King John, who wished this document to die and be forgotten about, was outwitted by the bishops with their desire to preserve the liberties of the church, with their desire to impose reform upon the realm. He was outwitted by those bishops who themselves obtained copies of Magna Carta that they carried off to their cathedral cities and publicized. Now, you can guess where this is going. That's your Magna Carta. That's the Salisbury Magna Carta. And now I am going to be very careful. Now, there are some interesting things about your Magna Carta. It's got writing on the back, like that writing I showed you from London. And the writing on the back tells us that this is the Great Charter of Liberties granted by King John. But it also includes a rather dangerous word, which I put in red there, duplicator. Now, what exactly that meant has never been agreed. Some people have said that it meant that there were two Magna Cartas in Salisbury. Nonsense. Can't possibly be true, can it? Can't be two of them. Some people have said that it means that Magna Carta was copied out into the Lincoln Register, that it was duplicated by being copied. That must be the answer. And the bit at the bottom, Diversorio primi inclusori, that's a description of where exactly you had to go in the archive, up the steps, down into the box, look in the following bit of the box. That's where you had to go to find it. Though how that actually helps you, given it was written on the back of the document, I'm not entirely sure. Now, here's another royal charter of the 1240s, and on the back of it, it also says duplicator. Well, this must show, surely, that it was copied into the Salisbury Register. It doesn't mean there were two of those charters, does it? Here's a charter of King Henry II, the father of King John. Here's the back of it, which initially said it's been duplicated, but then above it, someone's written triplicator. Now, that must mean that there were three of them. It can't mean that it was triplicated by being copied into a register. That does not make any sense. In other words, that duplicate or endorsement is significant because it suggests that you may once have had two of these. Those of you who are old enough to remember back to 1215, I do advise you to go and look in your attic and see if you can find the other one, because it would be a very nice thing to find, and you would be able to buy a very large house on the proceeds. The Lincoln Magna Carta was written by a scribe attached to the Bishop of Lincoln. The obvious thing to do with the Salisbury Charter, then, is to look at the scribes of the Bishop of Salisbury, who at that time was a man named Herbert Poore, the brother of Richard Poore. Now, I've done that, and I've done that in vain. I've looked at the majority of Herbert Poore's charters. There are about 20 of them, original charters, and they are not written, as far as I can tell, in the hand of your Magna Carta. This is another one. This is a letter. That one's a charter, the first one. This one is much more like a writ. I thought I might have got somewhere with this one. This is a charter of the Bishop of Salisbury, issued in 1214, a year before Magna Carta. It survives in the Wiltshire Record Office now in Chippenham. It's in favour of the monks of Stanley Abbey. And it is written in a hand that is very similar to your Magna Carta. But Tessa, to whom I've shown this, Tessa Weber, who is my paleographical guru, tells me that she is unconvinced. She won't say yes, she won't say no. That's what paleographers are like. But, as Emily will testify, Emily, your archivist, who was with me this morning, when having given up on Herbert Poore and Richard Poore and their charters, which are not, as far as I can tell, written in the hand of your Magna Carta, I thought I'd just do a sort of run around in your archive looking for documents issued in 1215, and I found this. Now, this is a charter issued in the name of Adam, the Dean of Salisbury. He took over when Richard Poore went off to be Bishop of Chichester at the beginning of 1215. So he was Dean of Salisbury at the time that your Magna Carta was issued. And he survived as Dean for a very brief time. He died in 1220. In other words, that's good, because it gives us a very narrow margin here of time. Now, what I've done there is superimpose that writing of the charter by the Dean of Salisbury. He didn't write it himself. He's using a clerk. I'll come back on to his identity in a moment. He's using a clerk, a scribe. But if you put your Dean of Salisbury and his charter up against the Salisbury Magna Carta, particularly those at the back, and it's really for you that I'm writing this paper, I defy you to tell the difference. Look particularly at the form of the T of teste at the end, witnessed by the chapter, and the form of testibus superdictis. Look at the forms of the letter P and H and G and the capital W's. They are all very, very similar. There's a wonderful line by Larkin that this will prove our almost instinct, almost true, that what survives of us, in this instance, is charters. And paleography is a little bit like that. It's instinctive and it's never entirely sure that it's actually proved something. But insofar as I can produce a rabbit out of a hat, that is my rabbit, and a very feeble one you may think it to be. It's a rabbit, though, with two ears, because that charter is sealed. It's sealed on one side, think of that two-sided seal that's gone round, on one side with the standard seal of the Dean and Chapter of Salisbury, which shows the Virgin Mary holding an apple with Christ reaching up for the apple, and then the inscription, and it says originally something like the Holy Virgin of Salisbury, the image of the Holy Virgin of Salisbury signs this. That's a standard seal of the Dean and Chapter. But the other side of that charter issued by the Dean is not sealed by the Dean Adam at all, but with this thing. Now, I cannot make out the image. I think it's a classical intaglio. It seems to me to be a standing figure, and they're generally classical. It will be Ceres, or it will be Artemis, or it will be some classical deity, generally. It may look like someone's head, or it may indeed look like a black pudding if you're sitting at the back, but believe me, there are actually two legs down the bottom of it. I think it's a classical figure. But it's the seal of someone called William of Wilton. Now, he was a canon of Salisbury. He was called Master William of Wilton, which implies that he was a learned man. And we must ask ourselves why he was sealing Dean Adams' charter round about 1215. Is it in fact the case that he wrote the charter, which is why his counterseal was used on the back of the seal of the dean and chapter? And is it even possible that when we ask the question, who wrote the Salisbury Magna Carta, we can now actually answer that not with a number or with something silly like the roundy-handed scribe or who knows, but with the answer, Master William of Wilton. And one other thing. If those charters were indeed written by episcopal scribes, and as I've shown I think they were, and if they looked rather different from the average run of royal charters, which again I think I've shown that they did, that leads on to one rather interesting reflection. We are taught today that those parts of the world where regnum and sacerdotium are identical, places that observe awful things like Sharia law, stand in total opposition to our tradition of freedom and liberty that takes us back to Magna Carta. But if you looked at the Salisbury Magna Carta or at the Lincoln Magna Carta in 1215, what you would be looking at, and you would have seen that you were looking at it, you would have noticed the difference, what you would have seen would be a charter that looked like a bishop's charter, not a king's. In other words, we're in a realm here where the bishops are actually laying down the law that today we use to argue that freedom and liberty are Western traditions, nothing to do with those ghastly traditions of parts of the world where we have declared in our madness an undying war against terrorism, whatever that may be. So, if you want to learn about this in greater detail, and you probably don't, but if you do come and see our exhibition in the British Library. It's a wonderful show. You'll see all sorts of things, not just these boring old charters, but all sorts of wonderful things like John's teeth. And do go on our website and add to our impact, which, again, in this world of madness, is all that really matters to me. Thank you very much.